Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Manish Papna. I'm the Executive Vice President of the World Resources Institute, a think tank based here in Washington, D.C. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel on a green economy for sustainable economies. This topic around a green economy and the importance of sustainability to the planet is an incredibly timely and important issue. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at today's newspapers, but if you just look at the headlines of today's papers, the number of articles around sustainability. This is about the Keystone XL oil pipeline, another one in the New York Times, another one in another major Washington paper about endowments investments in fossil fuels. This point about sustainability is front and center on many issues. This Keystone XL pipeline, which has been on the front pages of all the major papers today, is, as you know, a story about whether or not the U.S. government should approve a pipeline that would transport relatively dirty oil from the tar sands in Canada to the United States. And the argument that took place in the Senate yesterday was that protecting the environment should not trump the need to create jobs, to stimulate growth in this country. And I would argue that that is a false choice, and that the basic thesis of the session today is that reducing environmental risks, protecting ecosystems and the environment can actually go hand in hand with tackling poverty and improving economic growth. This may seem like wishful thinking by those of us who work in the environment, but increasingly there is strong empirical evidence that indeed promoting growth, tackling poverty can go hand in hand with protecting the environment, with reducing risks. UNEP, about 4 or 5 years ago, released a report called the Green Economy Report that began to compile strong economic evidence that helped make this point. A couple months ago, my organization, the World Resources Institute, along with about 10 other research institutes, actually released a report at the UN Climate Summit called Better Growth, Better Climate. It was chaired by former President of Mexico, Calderon. It had 24 commissioners, former heads of state, finance ministers, CEOs. And their basic argument that was contained within this report was that tackling climate change can be done in ways that strongly promote economic growth, that create jobs. And so this thesis, I think, is in part what we're going to be discussing today in this panel. And we're going to drill in on two particular issues. We're going to look at energy, and we're going to look at urbanization. And as part of the Solutions Forum, I'm going to briefly mention two solutions, one on energy, one on cities, that have been identified as particularly promising to tackling these broader challenges. And these are solutions that both tackle the sustainability issues, but do so in ways that also help address poverty, help deal with social inequity, that help promote growth. And one of the questions that we're going to be grappling with or talking about is, how do we scale these solutions? How do we identify and scale these solutions that actually can offer opportunities that are win-win, that are good for the planet, but also good for tackling poverty, good for people? I'm going to ask each of the panelists we have here, and we have a really distinguished set of folks, to make some remarks on these two solutions and to more broadly talk about South-South and triangular cooperation, drawing from a rich set of experiences from a number of different countries. UNEP's director, Achim Steiner, will be joining us shortly. He's also going to make some remarks as well on this topic, and then we will close. So it's a good, exciting program. And what I would like to do now is just take a couple of minutes, introduce our panelists, tell you a little bit about these two solutions, and then we're going to jump into this. So let me start with the order they are in the program. First, we have Mr. David Churcher to my left, immediate left, he is the Minister, Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum of Kenya. And prior to his nomination and appointment as Cabinet Secretary, he was a commissioner at the Interim Independent Electoral Commission, where he spearheaded the introduction, the application of information technology and other reforms in voter registration and election results management. We could have used some of your skills here in the United States not too long ago. Next, let me welcome Mr. Haibing Ma, who is the China Program Manager of World Watch Institute on the very left. His real main focus is around clean energy and climate change, including looking at the issue of the green economy in China. Trained both in China as well as now finishing his doctoral studies here in the United States. Let me turn to my immediate right, Mr. Andrew Rudd, Urban Environment Officer for UN Habitat. He's been working quite a bit as well on the post-2015 agenda for them. Quite interestingly, I found previously he worked as an architect managing the UN Secretary General's residence, which is quite a distinctive responsibility, I would imagine. Mr. Cletus Springer, Director of the Department of Sustainable Development of the OAS, based here in Washington, D.C., to my far right. He's a national of St. Lucia, served as his country's alternate governor to the bank and the fund, and he's also chairman of the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, Canary, which is based in Trinidad and Tobago. And to my left, Ms. Karen Costa Vasquez, who has a researcher and analyst working quite a bit on South-South and triangular cooperation. She's a member of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, working also quite a bit on the post-2015 agenda, and previously was with the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have a really good set of panelists from different countries looking at these issues from slightly different angles, but I think it's going to make for a really rich discussion. So one more thing I need to do is I just need to introduce the two solutions very briefly that we are going to talk about and discuss today. And I think all of you should have a write-up of these two solutions on your chairs. The first one is around energy. And I think the challenge with energy is we need energy to do three things all at the same time. We need to tackle the energy access problem. Still, 1 in 5 people around the world don't have access to modern forms of electricity. We need to tackle the growth problem. Many developing countries need energy in order to promote economic growth. But we also need to tackle the sustainability problem. Currently, over 85% of the energy mix is powered by fossil fuels, and that creates huge problems around air pollution, around water quality, and in particular around climate change. And it's in that context we have a very exciting solution emerging from East Africa called the African Rift Geothermal Development Project. It is, Africa has 15% of the world's population, but global electricity consumption is only 5%. The continent, however, has an abundance of untapped renewable energy. It includes hydro, wind, solar, biofuels, biomass, but also geothermal. Geothermal potential has been estimated to be over 20,000 megawatts of electricity, and the East Africa Rift Valley system is one of the most highly endowed regions on the planet when it comes to geothermal. And it's against this backdrop that in 2010, the project African Rift Geothermal Development Project was launched by 6 East African countries. We're going to hear more about that by the minister and others in just a moment, but that is one of the solutions that we wanted to share in this particular forum. The other solution had to do with urbanization. As with energy, urbanization is a major issue defining the world today. You're all familiar with the demographic trends that are taking place. The world is becoming massively more urbanized. Each week, 1.4 million people move into cities. That's the population of Stockholm each week. 90% of the urbanization is taking place in the developing world, most noticeably in Asia, And what I've been just told is Africa is the place with the fastest rates of urbanization. It's in that context that there is this new initiative called the Global Initiative on Resource Efficient Cities. One of the challenges with all this urbanization is that cities consume the vast majority of energy and other natural resources. And if we remain on current patterns of consumption, the implications it will have for the planet are mind-boggling. And so there's a need to think about how to design cities that are compact, that are resource efficient. And that is what this particular initiative is about, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that in just a moment. So with that setup, really pleased to now turn the floor over to Mr. David Churcher, who's going to focus in particular on some of the energy challenges facing East Africa, with a focus on geothermal and some of the work that his country has been leading in that sphere. David.
Thank you, Manish, and colleagues who are paneling with me this afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I just came in from Kenya almost this afternoon and came straight into, and for those of you who may not know where Kenya is, it is some 9-10 hours ahead of time. So I should possibly be doing my bedtime right now. Very quickly, it's nice to be in Washington again this time around to basically discuss this great global South-South development initiative that basically will go a long way in opening up those opportunities in Africa, where when we met here in August during the US-Africa Leaders Summit, with the Obama initiative Powering Africa and that $26 billion fund to support provision of power, I did have the opportunity to talk in one of those lunch sessions as a panelist and looked at Human Development Index with respect to the per capita power distribution in Africa. And this is a great initiative, Manish, that really is going a long way in opening up great opportunities in Africa. You'll appreciate, for example, that the rate of energy use or power consumed strongly affects national wealth and human development. And I did look at this in the context of Human Development Index and look at issues of education, poverty index, and then so on and so forth. But going more specifically home to Africa, and like we've said before, Africa is a large continent. It can take a few continents altogether put in there. And it's really the destination of great opportunity for those of us who could be sitting in the audience today as investors. With 5% penetration while representing 15% of the world population, you see great opportunity. We sit right, for example, Kenya, the equator crosses in between Kenya, and half of Africa sits up and half of Africa sits down to the south. And then so this presents great opportunities in tapping into solar energy, and with the vast development on solar PV panels today, and the fact that the continent is vast and in areas where there is no human settlement, off-grid solutions on solar are real great opportunities for investors to look at and basically harness the cost of solar panels, which have significantly come down today, to look at how to quickly provide clean, green energy into those communities that live dispersely in those particular areas. But as we even look at the two subjects today, energy and urbanization, with urbanization presenting great opportunity for us to pull people together into concentrated urban centers where social programs and services can easily then be provided, do for us in fact, rather than be a challenge in providing services, help us to more provide services in a more cost-effective way, because it's very difficult to provide services when people live spread all over the farms and not just for power, for road, for health services, and so on and so forth. I'll look very quickly into areas of specifics, using Kenya as a good example in Africa. And then very quickly, because I know time is going to be of essence, in Kenya, for example, we're looking at more and more developing clean energy, sustainable, affordable, but more importantly, competitive priced energy, because we do recognize not only that, even as we provide energy to support those indices and to support better life for our people in the continent, we do see the continent as the next destination of choice in terms of a least cost continent. If you are looking for new destination in terms of what you would call least cost countries, we should be able to get that from Africa, and therefore provide some of our manufacturing facilities, provide opportunities that would go a long way in providing power, creating opportunities for the people, and getting some of these people in this continent to live like the rest of the citizens of this world. In Kenya, for example, we do have some 2,300 megawatts of power on the grid. Lots of development, because we just added some 800 megawatts in the last 1 year, all of it coming from quite a bit of green development, geothermal. When I look at my framework or generation matrix, which I signed on my performance contracting with my president, I need to provide some 5,000 megawatts of electricity in the next 40 months. And very interestingly, 3,700 will come from green technologies, from solar, wind, geothermal, with geothermal coming up at 50%. Wow. Looking at providing and bringing down cost by over 40% in the same period. The one thing that Manish did mention is, of the 20,000 megawatts available in the Great Rift, 10,000 megawatts is available in Kenya, potentially. I want to confirm, Manish, today that in Kenya we deliver almost the 8th geothermal development country in the world, after Ireland, New Zealand, Italy, and so on and so forth. We dispatch 600 megawatts on the grid today on geothermal at 7 cents US. 7 cents US to the grid. In terms of dispatch of the total power that I did mention of some 790 gigawatt hours every month, 80% do come from green energy. In the month of October in Kenya, we did deliver 43% from geothermal, another 35% from hydro, and only 20% from fossil fuel. Quite exciting. So as you guys talk about reducing from 85% and coming down to those standards set up globally to ensure that we also do manage the environment, we are doing almost 85% already in Kenya. And I think because of time, we should be looking at that in more details. We did develop a feed-in tariff policy, which is published. And for those of us who want to develop power in solar, in wind, there's already a power purchase agreement, a standardized power purchase agreement with the Energy Regulatory Commission. And you do come in, you choose an area to do solar on wind, and we do have already a developed feed-in tariff for solar, for wind, for biomass, and so on and so forth. We covers also small hydros. Exciting hybrid systems which help in the intermittence management of power today, so that we are able to deliver on solar, on wind, and later on with the storage of hydro, we are able to cover. And I think all this goes into, and to just talk to, in one sentence as I finish, the initiative of the Great Rift or the geothermal development, that helps us to de-risk because geothermal development is expensive. And when I talk about doing a feed-in of 7 cents US, it's because of the great initiative that came in through programs like the Green Economies, Sustainable, and the De-risking Fund that helps us to work out the fields, establish the availability of steam, and so that when you come in, you either get a green field that has been de-risked, or you do get a steam that has been developed by one of our companies called Geothermal Development Company, and you build your power plant without bothering how to get the steam. You sign a steam purchase agreement, you sign a PPA for the government to buy all the power that you generate, and you are able to do a bankable business case because you are assured of availability of steam, you are assured of who is buying all the power that you generate, and therefore you are able to deliver your power at that 7 cents US, and yet have a very bankable business case that can support this population in Africa and be able to deliver the great citizens of this world living at a fairly good standard of life together. Thank you very much.
Great. Minister, thank you. That quite a remarkable story. I mean, it's great to be able to move beyond the anecdotal story or example and be able to provide real numbers at scale about this shift. And I just want to highlight 3 numbers you put out just to kind of impress upon the significance of what you're saying. Kenya's future additional kind of electricity capacity, 3,700 out of 5,000 megawatts would come from renewables. That renewables are able to be sold onto the grid at 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That is quite remarkable, and I suspect that that number will even go down as you scale and get greater.
While having a bankable PPA.
Once we have, and that 80% of the actual electricity generated was powered by renewables in the country of Kenya. So there's just a massive transformation taking place. Let me turn it over to Mr. Andrew Rudd, who's going to shift and talk a little bit more about urbanization and the global initiative on resource-efficient cities.
Thanks so much, Manish, and thanks as well to UNEP for this invitation, and likewise to OAS for hosting this entire expo. As Manish said, I'm representing UN Habitat. We are the UN Agency for Settlements, basically, and we enjoy sharing a global headquarters with UNEP in Nairobi, in Kenya. As no doubt many of you know, the world's population became 50% urban in more or less 2008. That will likely increase to 60% by 2030 and to 70% by 2050. Now that is an astonishing figure. It has taken the entire history of humanity to reach the number of urban dwellers we have today, and we are set to duplicate that in just 35 years. As Manish had also said, the vast majority of that growth is going to be in the developing world, and the vast majority of that in cities in Africa and in Asia. And unlike the cities of the developed world, which are by and large stagnating, and whose challenge over the next 35 years is going to have to be how to retrofit existing inefficient settlement patterns, there's a real opportunity for these fast-growing cities in Africa and Asia, and in some cases in Latin America, because they have the chance to set the stage correctly now in advance of the growth that they're facing, if they face that challenge correctly. A lot of that potential lies in the efficiency gains from agglomeration, from economies of scale, from the way that cities manage to concentrate resources, governance structures, infrastructure, this sort of thing. Cities produce something like 80% of the world's GDP, which is an astonishing figure for only containing about half of the world's population. At the moment, they're also consuming something between 60 and 80% of the world's resources and producing a similar amount of emissions. That we've got to get down, that's for sure. But they managed to do all this on just something like 4% of the Earth's surface area, which is an impressive figure. In theory, the more compact the city, the lower its per capita rates of resource use and emissions. Now, the problem with that theory is that most of the cities in the world are doing exactly the opposite. The data we have on global urban expansion shows that cities are becoming less and less and less dense, not more dense. And that's a very timely figure because our data shows that something like 60% of the area expected to be urban in 2030 still has to be built. So that effectively means that the way we're going now, cities will more than double in size in the next 15 years, far faster than they will double in population. So they're expanding spatially much faster than their populations, which, just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, means they are not, the settlement patterns they're adopting are not efficient ones. So they're not poised to make the kinds of efficiency gains that we would hope. What do these kinds of fast-growing cities need? What are the challenges they're facing? Well, many of them are incredibly dynamic, but they also face massive infrastructural backlogs. Some have never even been able to see the positive efficiencies of cities. All they see is proliferating slums. And so some national governments in response, some have tried to make urbanization illegal, which needless to say is not helping the problem. Others have basically given up the kind of project, the urban project, to the private sector, which is good at some things, but not necessarily good at things like setting the stage, reserving public space, rights of way, etc. And so you end up with a lot of cities that are being developed in kind of superblock fashion, which is to say gated, segregated residential compounds with housing developments where you can't walk, really designed for the car, replicating some of the big mistakes that, frankly, we in this country are just now realizing that we've made over the last decades. Very few have managed, I would say, an excellent balance between growth and sustainability. One city we found in the middle of Brazil, it's a small city, really off the international radar, managed to establish an urban growth boundary. They prioritized infill and vertical densification in the city center, and were able to keep peri-urban agricultural land intact, which is livelihoods for farmers, food security for the city, and revitalize a lot of the public spaces with BRT, et cetera, in the middle. So if this is a good example, I suppose the question is how can other cities harness the kind of decoupling that this one managed to achieve? In 2010, we had the World Expo in Shanghai, and that was really the first World Expo to focus purely on cities. And cluster of three exciting things emerged after that expo. Firstly, UN Habitat launched a guidebook series called Urban Patterns for a Green Economy. And this was based on some of the demands we were hearing from cities in the developing world. They'd heard enough of principles, of theory. What they wanted to hear more of was inspiring examples of what cities like them had managed to achieve successfully, things they might contextualize and apply in their own circumstances. So just to give a tiny sampling, cities like Hangzhou in China, which managed to work with nature by establishing a landscape mosaic plan that in the peri-urban areas managed to preserve green patches and corridors and reduce the pollution from factories. Cities like Medellin in Colombia that established a metro cable system to give access, low carbon transport access to the very dense favelas in the surrounding slopes. And cities like Durban in South Africa that took essentially a landfill, capped it, treated the leachate, captured the methane for electricity generation, and managed to educate school children about how to revitalize the native vegetation. And I need to hurry up here. Something else that happened, Habitat and UNEP were involved on something called the International Resource Panel, Cities Working Group. Some of the same players. We were looking at some of the flows of materials and resources in cities, how to begin to quantify these, and one thing that grew out of that was the Global Initiative for Resource Efficient Cities that Manish mentioned, and Habitat enjoys working with UNEP on, that's really about establishing a global standard for how these sorts of things can be measured. So that cities can actually establish baselines, they can begin to monitor the changes, hopefully improvements that they're making. And in terms of scaling up, that GI REC program is looking at moving from 20 to 50 to 100 cities and moving more from input types of actions like funding to outcome actions like reduction of 50% of GHG emissions and the like. But we're seeking, this will be my final mention, to broaden that to a study really of the city as a whole. And so we have a component which we're calling Beyond Urban Sprawl. And this is really looking at the entire settlement patterns of these fastest growing cities. How, again, as I was saying, we can encourage these cities to set the stage now correctly in advance of this growth. Because what we find is that oftentimes the patterns we put in place in cities can be there for 1,000 years. They are very expensive to change and to improve, and if these fast-growing cities can get it right now, then they are actually in an incredible position to yield some of these dividends, both in terms of lowering per capita resource use and emissions, and also some of the social dividends. Integrated communities with work, jobs, services triangle, all things close together, lowered commutes, cohesion, and et cetera. So that's what we're aiming for with these. I will end with that and pass back to Manish.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. That was a brilliant summary of the urbanization challenges in 8 minutes. Just to stress, the point that, the space case, the default, most cities are growing outwards instead of upwards. But you pointed out a number of really promising examples from the developing world where we're seeing that change. Real examples of solutions from developing country cities that are actually finding ways to both improve the quality of life and do so in ways that are environmentally sustainable. And the point that spatial form matters. How you get the spatial form, the urban design matters tremendously. So thank you. We have 3 more, and I know there's a lot of questions I'm already getting in from social media, so I'll ask you to hold your questions just for a few more minutes, but we will have time for a Q&A. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Haibang Ma, who's going to focus a bit more now on clean energy in China, and perhaps may also have a few reflections on the big announcement from last week that President Obama and Premier Xi made in Beijing. Haibang?
Yeah, thanks, Manish. It's a great honor to be here, joining with these distinguished panelists. Here today, they're talking about clean energy in China and how does China's experience in developing its clean energy would help other developing countries, basically, promote this global South-South development in terms of clean energy. Why China? Because by sheer size, with non-fossil fuel energy installed capacity of close to 400 gigawatts, China is already the world's #1 clean energy market. It's larger than the rest of the following 3 largest clean energy markets combined. For example, US with 172 gigawatts, Germany is 84 gigawatts, and India with 71. And if you probably have heard that last week, there's a big announcement between US and the Chinese president. They jointly announced the new climate goal. There is an emission goal, which is for China to reach its emission cap by 2030. I want to talk into that deal on that side because on this Friday I will be joining U.S. Climate Action Network for a briefing to the U.S. Senator exclusively on that target. So you're more than welcome to attend that one. But here today we're talking about clean energy. And during last week's announcement, the Chinese president also announced that by 2030, China will wish to reach a share of non-fossil fuel energy among its total energy, primary energy consumption by 20%. And right now, the ratio is about 9.8. So in 16 years, increased 10%, you probably think that it's more than that much, but just by absolute value, considering that in the next 16 years, China will probably increase its total energy consumption by at least 1.6 times. That would require China to put an extra of 800 to 1,000 gigawatts of clean energy into its grid. And that's about like 3/4 of China's current total electricity generation capacity, and which is amazing. None of the countries in the world have done that in such a huge value of this thing. And but China really developed its clean energy in a very short time window. Like 10 years ago, in 2005, for example, China's wind power installed capacity is much less than 1 gigawatt, but now it's close to 100 gigawatts. So basically, in the last 10 years, Chinese renewable sectors grow at least double-digit each year. Some of years even like double the figures. So how China achieved that? First and foremost, there is a policy support. The Chinese government provide strong and consistent policy incentives to business and to local government to develop clean energy sectors. And second, also the financial support is inevitable and is crucial to that. And the Chinese government also provide huge subsidies to its clean energy sectors out of the government revenue. And also there are tax credits and there are market approach as well, like feed-in tariff and the electricity price reform and its traditional fossil fuel sector reform, for example, the coal sector. And and also there is a huge public education program going on in China, just to let the regular people know the advantage of clean energy. And if you ask a normal Chinese person at the street, you probably will be astonished to find that their knowledge and the awareness of environmental problems and the vital importance of deal with climate change issues is great. I'd say it's much greater than here in the United States. And overall, I think China's achievement is due to the Chinese government has put this clean energy as its national strategies. The political leader view the clean energy sector as a leapfrog mechanism for China to catch up with the developed world, because they see that globally, clean energy is relatively new as a new sector. So if China invests more into this sector, it can, be the leaders. And the result also shows, if you look at the top 10 solar PV panel manufacturers in the world, last year, 7 out of 10 is based in China. This is, is amazing result. And but we also think that there are some lessons learned during China's development of clean energy, and the lessons learned could also be valuable for other developing countries. The first is how to balance the government promotion and the market approach. There is argument that the Chinese government may rely too heavily on subsidies, and which cause its the businessmen and the renewable energy companies react less actively to the market change. For example, during the 2009 and 2011, there's overheated investment into solar PV panel manufacturing sector, and when the European market shrinks, and that caused a lot of wasted capacity in China, and now they have to, boost the domestic need, which is not a bad thing, but in terms of the wasted productions, that's a huge problem for the industrial sector. And there is also environmental concerns. Just to produce more clean energy doesn't mean that the process will be clean as well. Actually, in fact, that happened in China. Some of the PV panel manufacturing facility has a lot of pollution issues, and which even incurred some local residents' protest. And you probably have heard some of the reports. Our strong argument is that this provide a clear signal that if you want to build a sustainable future, that will require the approaches and the process you are using should be sustainable in practice as well. You cannot just apply an idea and hope it will work well, but you have to look at the entire lifetime process to make it sustainable. And lastly, China will also need more science-based and the decision-making process and systematic thinking. If you're looking at China's the clean energy goals in future, hydro is still the most important part of it. And China now has a very aggressive and ambitious plan for hydro plants, especially during the southwestern area. And since China shares all those major rivers with neighboring countries, China's plan created a lot of tension between with those countries. And the local residents also reflecting that if you build up all the dams, all the ecological system, the original ecological system that the local residents have been heavily rely on could be changed forever. So I think in the future, when China ramp up its clean energy plans, it will need to have more science-based and systematic thinking of that. And just to put a little bit perspective on urbanization, that how urbanization would create both challenging and opportunities for China's clean energy development. Right now, China, back in 1990, China's urban population is only about 26%, and by end of last year, it's about 52%. And China is expected to reach urbanization rate of 70% in 2035. And now China has a rural population of more than 600 million. And so if you look at the numbers, basically means that in the next 16 years, China will mobilize a couple of 100 extra million people into the cities. And the urban life and the rural life have entirely different energy consumption pattern. In China's case, the per capita energy consumption in rural area and in urban area is 4 to 5 times than the rural area. So this creates a lot of burden for future clean energy production. But it's also some kind of opportunity, just as Andrew just said, because the more dense the population are, more cost effective to provide energy. And lastly, I'm talking about how China's experience and the lessons could contribute to the global South-South development on clean energy development. And at World Watch, we agree that China could provide more green aid and green investment to other countries. First, you can provide technology and the knowledge transfer. Since China already have a lot of experience in PV moduling, manufacturing, wind turbine manufacturing, so it's good practice for them to transfer that kind of knowledge to other countries. And also there are capacity building, that will include strategic planning, personal training things, and China could also provide that. And at World Watch, we have a program called the Sustainable Energy Roadmap, basically to integrate technology assessment, policy recommendation, socio-economic modeling, and lifetime investment suggestions into this kind of project. And we already successfully launched in Caribbean countries, small island countries like Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Jamaica. And now we are expanding it to Central America and to India, to Africa. And hopefully will help the government to not just scaling up its own domestic clean energy market, but also help to transfer their knowledge and experience to other developing countries. And finally, we have a vision that maybe we can link the South-South platform and mechanism to the existing North-South mechanism. For example, maybe if China or India provide any assistance to other recipient developing countries, they can receive credit into this UNEP climate change or mitigation or adaptation credit. And that would be an ideal way to provide more incentive to this global South-South development. And if you have more ideas, you are more than welcome to contact me. And because we are in the initial stage now, more innovative ideas are welcomed. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very insightful perspective on clean energy in China. Quite interesting, if one were to look in the 1970s, the US was the leader on solar energy. 1980s, it shifted to Japan. 1990s, 2000s, it was Germany. Last 5 years, it's China. And I think what's quite interesting is, who's going to take it up? But I think we're seeing this shift to where the developing world is starting to really take global leadership on many clean energy technologies, which is quite exciting. Let me turn now to Mr. Cletus Springer, who's going to focus, I think, a bit both on some of the energy and urbanization issues, but from a particular perspective around Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I usually find when I'm in these panels, perhaps because of my background from the Caribbean and my sensitivity to the fact that small island states issues are not often captured in the discussions, I find I'm obliged to put these issues on the table. So forgive me if I do that too often in my presentation. You are in a building, in an organization that is perhaps the oldest in terms of its standing in South-South cooperation. I would class the OAS as the oldest South-South cooperation entity in the world. Over the years, we have seen the evolution from one of cooperation to one of partnership taking place among countries directly, bilaterally, multilaterally, and sometimes with the centrifugal, you might say, support of the Organization of American States. Our mandates in the areas of under discussion this afternoon have come from the very highest levels of our member states, from presidents and heads of state down to ministers of environment and sustainable development and so on. And we've been dealing in energy and cities issues for more than 40 years. And we've seen a situation where the region has made dramatic improvements in terms of energy access. We're not quite there yet. There's still about 1 in every 15 people in Latin America and the Caribbean who don't have access to affordable energy. And there's still large pockets of darkness, you might say, in the region insofar as energy access is concerned. So the off-grid options that Minister Churcher mentioned in the case of Africa are still very relevant for us in Latin America and the Caribbean. I was particularly intrigued by the geothermal risk facility that Africa has instituted because the Caribbean is almost on a similar path in terms of establishing a risk facility for geothermal drilling. And I think there's much, Minister, that the Caribbean can learn from Africa, from Kenya in particular, in terms of how to approach this particular challenge. We have about four islands in the Caribbean now that are gearing up to set up geothermal energy facilities. The challenge that these islands face is not quite the issue of risk management, which is a significant one. The real challenge is one of the very limited fiscal window that the islands have to take on additional debt. Most of these islands are indebted, some of them to the level of more than 100% of their gross domestic product. And so they don't have any room to offer any kind of support to private sector initiatives in that respect. So we need more than just a risk management facility. We need a financial mechanism that is large enough to allow these countries to tap into these mechanisms. In the Organization of American States, we have a Sustainable Cities Initiative, Andrew, that I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, and we'd be very keen to pair up with you and with GREC to see how we can share our lessons across various areas. In this initiative, which is largely funded by the United States government, we are working not just at the local government level, but we're also working through civil society to try to induce the changes that are necessary within communities and so on. As opposed to the top-down approach, we are taking it at a more bottom-up kind of approach as well. We do training, capacity building. We have a course that starts in Trinidad in the first week of December, where we are training city planners, social planners, and their ilk to look at cities afresh, drawing heavily from the best practice and so on that we have in the Colombias, in the Medellins, in Mexico, and so on. When I did planning way back in the 80s, the issues are not they're the same, but they have evolved. And I think in many respects, the whole policy and planning platform for sustainability has to be revisited. I think we need policies that are more adaptable. I think we need planning frameworks that are more integrated. In many cases, we still, in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a siloed approach to policy planning and development planning, and we need to change that to a more integrated approach. The scaling up issue is a huge one for many Latin American and Caribbean countries. In the case of climate change, the challenge is one of scaling down models and so on of climate change adaptation and things of that sort. We have in the Caribbean a climate change center, which is devoted to doing research on climate change models and so on, and helping the islands in the Caribbean to make the adjustments in policy to treat adaptation issues. Permit me to just zoom in on the push and pull factors of urbanization for just a little bit. 2 minutes left. That's amazing how time flies. I think we need to address in city renewal and city planning both the push and the pull factors that are at work, the dynamics of that. And in the OES, that is exactly the approach that we're taking. We're seeking to make cities more livable. We're working with small and medium enterprises. We're working with off-grid communities in the case of energy. We're working with our partners in the Inter-American Cooperation on Agriculture to look at the possibility of introducing city farming and things of that sort. There's one initiative that I feel impelled I should mention, and that is our efforts in relation to promoting a circular economy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Moving consumption and production from the conventional approaches of linear approaches to sustainable consumption and production to one of a circular economy kind of approach. And we have a closed loop cycling project which is ongoing now in 3 countries, in Ecuador, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, and in Panama, where we're working with these countries to help them to introduce more sustainable methods of consumption and production. We're looking, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, to identify alternatives to styrofoam containers, and we're doing an assessment of agricultural residues and agricultural products to assess their ability to be used as alternatives to styrofoam. In the case of disasters, and we haven't spoken about the issues of inequality and inequity in the discussion so far, but these are the silent factors that are at work that must be addressed in any approach at sustainability in cities and so on. And we are trying to do this in the OES in the context of disaster risk management in the first case. In the case of education, we are trying to improve access to education. We're trying to improve access to land, basically removing the factors, these predisposing factors that lead to disasters, that lead to inequity, that lead to inequality, that lead to marginalization and things of that sort. But my time is up. I will end it here, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to come back and give you some more details. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Cletus, for kind of bringing the issues we've been talking about down to a local level and about some of the challenges or the ways in which one would look at that from the perspective of the Caribbean or the Latin American region more broadly. Our final speaker, Ms. Karen Costa Vasquez, is going to talk a little bit more about some of the research she's been doing around South-South cooperation and some of the lessons learned. Karen?
Thank you, Manish. And thanks to UNEP for the invitation to speak at the panel. I'm really delighted with the opportunity. And as I always say, I always feel very excited to see so many people here in this room and also online, following us on Twitter and on the website. And mostly, more importantly, interested in engaging in debates on South-South cooperation. That's really, really exciting for me. The other presentations focus is on specific topics on green economies and how to promote green economies, particularly renewable energies and sustainable cities. I'll share some insights on how to replicate and scale up some South-South cooperation initiatives that cut across all areas, including those that we've been discussing in this panel. And as Manish previously mentioned, this is based on my previous research and also my experience managing on South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation initiatives. Now, over the past 2 days, we've heard many examples of South-South cooperation approaches, modalities, instruments, and how they vary so much across countries and regions. We saw examples from China, Brazil, India, Nigeria, Cuba, ranging from dispatch of doctors to respond to Ebola crisis, to financial assistance on different areas. What I would like to highlight here is that a common pattern among all on these South-South cooperation initiatives is actually the exchange of development experiences that were previously tested in countries that face similar challenges, and in many cases that also share similar socioeconomic, geographic, and climatic characteristics. So the truly distinctive nature of South-South cooperation is not necessarily the financial nor the material resources that are transferred or provided to other countries, but the demand for experiences in designing and implementing public policies that address specific development issues. That being said, how can countries realize the full potential of South-South cooperation initiatives in line with the priorities and the internationally agreed development goals? So 2 key insights here. The first one is focus on the knowledge and the learning process. This has a concrete, a very practical implication on the one side, on how countries share the experiences with each other. That means how they identify, how they package, how they design and transfer the initiatives. And on the other side, how countries learn from these experiences and eventually turn these experiences into public policies in their countries, in their contexts. To address these questions, we need to think of the concepts of enablers and really understand what are the success drivers and also the challenges in implementing specific development experiences in a particular setting, and how these, and to what extent these success drivers, these enablers, they are present in the partner country. In the example of the African Rift Geothermal Development Facility, for instance, how can the experiences in Kenya inform the design and the implementation of similar initiatives in other geothermal potential countries like Burundi, Comoros, Djibouti, DRC, Malawi, and so forth? What are the policy, what are the leadership, technical funding, legal requirements that must be in place, and what was learned within the Kenyan experience that could be provide inputs to this exchange. And the second key element that I would like to highlight is how South-South cooperation partners should consider when replicating and scaling up initiatives is the focus on the integrated and structuring approach to development. Many South-South cooperations, they are focused mostly on traditional technical cooperation, but also increasingly on a combination of different modalities between technical, scientific, educational cooperation, and so forth. They're also being shared through public and privately funded collaborative instruments, such as knowledge and scientific networks, technology transfers, loans, private investments, and these more robust delivery modalities, they comprise sequenced activities over a longer period of time, rather than static or one-off exchanges. And also, they also tend to go beyond building skills or training initiatives to also include systems design and strengthening institutions in the partner countries. So to provide some examples of how could this be applied, for instance, in practical terms, is many countries are developing knowledge networks to create and strengthen implementation and also the links with policies. These knowledge networks, they're offering permanent space for South-South cooperation partners to share ideas and best practices in specific development areas through capacity building activities, and also to build information based on specific development areas, so data exchange, case studies, negotiation platforms, and so forth. These networks, they also provide links with the policy frameworks and developing policy frameworks and making more effective use of the resources and expertise to facilitate this learning process among the countries. So to conclude, when sharing and scaling up development experiences, South-South cooperation initiatives, they really need to take into account these two key elements among so many other issues that we've already discussed, but I would like really to highlight these two, which is the knowledge and the knowledge sharing and the learning process, and also how you can provide, design South-South cooperation initiatives that really look at a more integrated approach. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. It's great. Earlier you heard some serious analysis research on the actual solutions. It's great to also see some people doing some serious research on the scaling and what lessons we can learn about how to inform South-South cooperation. So a really important intervention from Karen. What I'd like to propose we do now is let's take a few questions from the floor. We have a couple from social media. Give Akim, who joined us, the head of UNEP, a moment to absorb and hear a bit of what the conversation is about. We'll do a little Q&A, and then I'll maybe ask Akim to say a few words before we close. So let's open it up to your questions and comments. Yes, do we have a microphone? Yes. So.
Good afternoon. Thank you, panelists. It was very informational. What I primarily concentrate is there's a lot of renewable energy that are coming to utility large scale. Do you all interested in more or less distributed generation on site, especially with new urbanism, and for rural communities that are not on the grid? Is that something that you all are in the Caribbean islands as well? Is that battery storage, et cetera, et cetera? Is that something that's of interest to your communities and moving forward?
So why don't we take a couple of questions? I have a couple of questions from social media, and then I'll come back to the panelists to see who would like to respond to what. Yes.
Thank you.
And if you could just introduce yourself briefly, and then.
My name is Inyanga Bong-Harstrup, and I'm the Deputy Director at the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. And this is for Minister Churcher. And I'm hoping this won't be too incorrect to ask, but I wonder if you could say a little bit about the energy mix and having a balance between the renewables and the oil and gas. And we know that Kenya has substantial amounts of these two resources. And we do believe that they can contribute, if managed properly, to the growth of the economy. And I just wondered, because there was such a big story about the renewables, what you plan to do about the oil and gas, which we know that you are exploring. Okay, thank you.
And we'll take a question in the back.
Thank you, Richard Jordan from the Royal Academy of Science International Trust. On the renewable energy mix, is anyone looking at the use of renewable energy, especially solar, in low-impact tourism facilities? Thank you.
Let's take one or two more questions, and then I'm going to read a couple of social media questions. Akim is going to make a few remarks, and then at the end, we're going to ask our panelists to respond as part of their closing remarks to the questions. Please.
Cosmas Jita, I'm also with the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. And my question again is for the minister from Kenya. East Africa is becoming an energy hub with discoveries of oil and gas in the region. My question is, are the countries in the region coming up with a strategy to work together through South-South Cooperation to harness these resources collectively?
One more question right there.
Thank you very much. My question is to the whole panel. Basically, I'm from Bangladesh. And my question is, there are many countries like Bangladesh who don't have geothermal potential to generate energy or electricity. So it's like my country. That is, so my question is, that is, do you have any other suggestions? That is how this country they can meet their the energy crisis, because if there is the generation of energy, it is linked with the environmental degradation or something like that. So there's a huge link between these two. So the country who don't have enough potential of geothermal, so what alternatives they have? So this is a question to the whole panel. Thank you very much.
Great. Final question. If you could just make it quite brief, please.
尊敬的主持人和各位嘉宾，我是来自中国浙江安吉县的县长，很高兴参加今天的会议，并且聆听各位精彩的演讲。安吉县呢是中国最著名的竹乡，是中国第一个生态县。2012年还获得了联合国环境联合国的人居奖。那么。我们安吉县虽然是中国第一个生态县，但是我觉得生态建设的实践和努力是一个长期的过程。那么我想请问一下，主持人和各位嘉宾，类似于我们这样的地区，如何更好地走生态绿色可持续发展的道路？我们环境署对我们有什么好的建议？那么同时呢，我们也愿意积极的参与南南合作。我们在这方面能够做些什么？谢谢。
I guess there's no Chinese interpretation, so I will be a translator. He said, "Dear moderator and the panelists, I'm the director of Anji County in Zhejiang Province, China. It's a great pleasure for me to attend the conference today and listen to your speeches. Anji is well known as the home of bamboos in China. It is the first eco-county in China and has been awarded of the UN Habitat Award in 2012. However, although Anji is the first eco-county in China, the practices and the capacity of ecosystem construction is still in a long process. Here, I have a question for the panelists, and he told me especially he wants to address the question to Mr. Achim Steiner. For regions and areas like us how to better carry out ecosystem development in a green and sustainable way. What's your suggestion for us? And at the meantime, we are willing to be actively involved in UNEP activities. What kind of programs and projects can we cooperate with UNEP? Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for those excellent questions. I'm just going to read out two more very quick questions. One from WeChat, the Chinese social media platform. Urbanization is rapidly spreading across the globe. What lessons or advice does China have to give the rest of the world based on their experiences in Beijing and Shanghai, especially regarding various forms of pollution? And we have another a question from Twitter from Christina Lund. Developing countries are discovering fossil fuel deposits. What is the incentive not to drill and go into renewables instead? And I think that mirrors some of the questions that we heard earlier. So there's a rich set of questions. I wonder whether I can ask maybe Achim to make a few broader remarks, and if he wants to take up a couple of these questions in his response, that would be terrific, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Manesh, first of all, and to my distinguished panelists. Sorry to join you a little bit at the tail end of this. I think, Clayton, you knew that I was going to be a little bit behind schedule, but you still gave us the wonderful hall here. Just makes me think, when we built the UNEP and Habitat headquarters in Nairobi, we wouldn't quite conceive of our meeting halls in this way anymore, but there's something fantastic about the grand spirit of the OAS, its history, and also to be here as a family for the South-South Expo. I will just offer a few remarks, but I think already some of the questions that were posed, both that you read out just now and from the audience, speak to the fact that there are many stories to be told. I think the first thing that I would say, I was still on the way here trying to understand how we came up with the title Green Economy for Sustainable Economies, because in my mind, a green economy is a sustainable economy, or a sustainable economy must be a green economy. So perhaps some of the other speakers have dwelt on it. The point is that we are living in an age where the collective footprint of humanity, economically speaking and ecologically speaking, is putting us into new territory. Territory that is, by some described in scientific terms as planetary boundaries, by others who work in the energy markets as peak oil or peak something else. By ecologists, it may often be described as ecological degradation and over-utilization of resources, or the other end of the extreme being pollution and, in a sense, the footprint of our actions. Whichever entry point you take, the interesting thing is that we're actually living in an age of convergence where the theory of sustainable development, as some view it, namely that we have to think about social, environmental, and economic dimensions of development, is increasingly not an analytical construct anymore of a desired outcome of development. It is actually the reality of what is driving decision-making today. We live in an age where social tensions around equity, inequity, access to resources or non-access are beginning to tear societies apart, where unemployment is simply no longer something that we can attribute to a cyclical issue. We are dealing with countries where 30 to 40% of the youth have no jobs, and this is in industrialized countries. Never mind the lack of countries being able to offer employment prospects to their graduates from universities who end up being taxi drivers or people who have to work on the informal sector on the roadside in order to survive. Economically speaking, the drivers are equally pronounced. We have a resource-dependent global economy that is extremely volatile, and if you don't believe in it, just look at the fluctuation in world food prices. In our markets and the way we transact food today, literally a shock in one producing area overnight is priced into the global market for grains and food grains and translates overnight into a phenomenon where millions of people are no longer able to buy their basic food crop. The same is true for the price of oil. People celebrate at the moment the reduction in the price of crude oil per barrel on the world's oil markets. What a strange thing to do. the worst thing that can happen to us today is actually a drop in the price of oil. And I won't go into the details of this, but we have just this morning released the 2014 UNEP emissions gap report, which again tries to understand how is the world in terms of acting on climate change with its commitments at national level, measuring up to where science has told us we need to be. Without going into the details, let me tell you that already over half of the known reserves of fossil fuels today are unextractable by virtue of the limits that the IPCC has given us, which is we have merely 1,000 gigatons left of pollution space in the atmosphere for carbon dioxide for the rest of history in the sense of the next 100 to 200 years. At the rate at which we are emitting right now, that space will have been used up in the next 30 to 40 years. To some, this all still seems to be science fiction, but the fact of the matter is that a significant part of the known fossil fuel reserves, in theory available to us today, will most likely not be extracted anymore 50 or 100 years down the line, which poses an interesting situation to a country such as Kenya or Tanzania or Uganda, as somebody pointed out, where oil has just been found. And let's be very clear, the debate is not unique to East Africa. The debate is alive there, the debate is alive in Canada and the United States. As you all know, everybody has their Keystone pipeline or their next fossil fuel bonanza before it's too late. The question is, how does the world prepare itself for this? And that's where I return to this point that when we talk about green economies or sustainable economies, and to me they are really interchangeable terms if you take them at their true intended definition, which is that what we do today must not deprive the next generation from being able to have the choice to do the same or not the same. And that is an ecological, it's an economic, and it's a socially interwoven set of parameters or indicators. Now, the transition towards a world in which we, as the emissions gap report said this morning, we are looking at a scenario where in the second half of the century we need to live in a zero net carbon dioxide emissions world. That doesn't mean zero emissions. It simply means that whatever the planet can still capture and store in terms of additional carbon dioxide will define how much we can emit above zero. These are radical transformations. These are shifts in our energy economies, our transport economies, in the way we run buildings, our urban infrastructure, that are unprecedented. The financial implications of this are enormous. But as also Andrew Steer pointed out this morning in the press conference with the Calderon Commission's report on the climate economy, what people often forget, we're going to be spending trillions anyway on infrastructure in the energy, transport, urban sectors, and moving from a business as usual scenario to a green economy scenario sometimes simply means that instead of spending 90 trillion in the next, 25 years? No, not quite, 20 years, 15 years, yeah, till 2030, may just require an extra 3 trillion to actually move towards a low carbon or zero net emissions energy generating infrastructure. These transitions are happening, and I take the question also that came from the floor, what do you do if you don't have geothermal? Well, in one sense, you're really badly off, let's be honest. But then lots of countries were badly off because they didn't have coal or they didn't have oil. Some countries were badly off because they had oil and because they have coal. And that is also the story of the 19th and the 20th century. What I would say to a country today is your greatest bet is to strengthen your autonomy from the world's energy markets and invest, first of all, in the renewable energy resources you have. Wind power is already in most countries today on the verge of becoming cost competitive with fossil fuel sources of energy. Photovoltaic is changing almost overnight the economics of being able to be deployed. Wave power is on the forefront of technology development. So there are other renewable energy sources, but there is also investments in energy efficiency and in smart grids. We need to start thinking in terms of electricity and energy for an energy resource poor country, just like we would in terms of food security. You can spend 5 times more growing your own food, or you can import it from your neighbors. We need to invest in smart grids. We need to connect grids, as we have seen in Southern Africa, in parts of Latin and South America, and also in Europe. At the end of the day, we, however, have to make choices, and I think one of the great challenges, particularly when we work also together with UN Habitat, is that it's extraordinary how slow decision makers and investors are in responding to these signals. The propensity to repeat what you have done before is no more visible, and frustratingly so, as in the urban spaces being built and built yet again along lines that we know already for at least 50 years are not adding to the intelligent urban landscape. 60% roughly of the world's urban infrastructure that we will have in 35, 40 years from now is yet to be built. What an extraordinary opportunity to do things just slightly more intelligently. And here I take the question also from our colleague from China in terms of ecosystems. Part of our difficulty in reinventing our economies against the backdrop of these factors of change is that very often we are in an almost exclusively economically defined policy space, and ecosystems don't feature in the systems of national accounting. They don't feature in gross domestic product calculations. They don't feature in terms of the loss of natural or national wealth when they are destroyed. So my first response to what does one do? One has to identify where is the pressure point, where is destruction most prominent and most critical to the functioning of an ecosystem. Secondly, how do you value in economic terms, and that is also in economic terms, not only in the value of the services of a functioning wetland, a forest ecosystem, or as Kenya has so brilliantly baptized its mountain forest, the water towers of the nation. Because once they're gone, you will struggle. And a recent article actually said that even in a country such as Kenya and Nairobi, water scarcity is a very real economically constraining factor within a time horizon of 5 to 10 years. You have to then translate that valuation into a kind of pricing structure. What are the externalities? Who is benefiting from the degradation or overuse of an ecosystem, and how do you turn that around and turn it into an investment by its users? More efficient, less destructive. It creates a circular economy logic, if you want, as it is often called in China, for maintaining ecosystems. And before you know it, you will not only have the public sector, but also the private sector investing in ecosystems. And people always look at me and say, is this not a bit naive? Colleagues, go into any city today and have a look at where the most expensive real estate of a city is. It is not next to the factories, it's not next to the highways, it's next to that little bit of green that is left in our cities, whether in terms of a city park or a little lawn or a quieter spot. People are perfectly capable of translating ecosystem values, either in biophysical services or others, into an economic reality, for better or for worse. But the problem is not translating valuation into economic price signals. So let me end by just saying that we had the great honor last year of hosting, together with our colleagues in the Secretariat, the South-South Expo in Nairobi. We did put the issue of green economy very much on the front burner of the discussion then, because what we have found and keep on finding is that if you don't treat this as some sort of ideological debate, or you don't say an economy is either green or black or blue or brown, but that countries are at different paces with different ideas transforming their economies in the light of these factors, then in every country across the planet you will find examples. And the most important lesson of the South-South Expo last year that I want to simply echo in my closing is that this is not an agenda that is first and foremost one of relevance to developed countries. There it is actually an obligation and an absolute necessity. For developing economies, for emerging economies, it is perhaps the greatest opportunity to leapfrog, to save in redundant infrastructure, and to open up new markets. Let me just give you two figures to illustrate that. The global photovoltaic trade, in terms of production of photovoltaic panels, 8-9 years ago, was in terms of the source countries for export and production located to the tune of 75% in industrialized countries. As of last year, 75% of all photovoltaic production actually is taking place in the global south, and more than half of that is exported on a south-south basis. And China clearly has been a key player in here, and it has lowered the price for so many countries, including many African nations, to enter into the solar and photovoltaic economy as never before. South Africa, with a green economy policy in place, has just conducted, or is in the midst of conducting, its fourth auction in terms of renewable energy. 3 have been conducted in the last 2 years. An extraordinary amount of $14 billion has been raised, billion, not $1 million, for investments in wind and photovoltaic infrastructure. 80% of those 14 billion have been sourced on the domestic market, financial and capital markets of South Africa. And perhaps the most dramatic and interesting development is that in just 2 years, the price per kilowatt hour that South Africa had to offer in the first bid and is likely to offer in its fourth bid cycle has gone down by 68% for wind and by over 55% for photovoltaic technology. These are the numbers that speak to why green economy pathways in technologies, in sectors, in urban areas, transport, energy, are not the exclusive domain of rich countries. Exactly the opposite, we believe, is the case. And we can see that from Nicaragua to Brazil, but also from Spain, Denmark, Portugal, Germany, through Kenya, Morocco, South Africa, right into the heart of China, and also, yes, oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, which are beginning to realize that it's much more interesting to produce electricity domestically by using photovoltaic power than to use up one's own oil for that which sooner or later does not make economic sense. So here are a few, I think, key messages that are as much about the frontier of technology and economic transition as they are about South-South cooperation, from the basics of technology right through to the progressive policies that are being developed in many different countries. So thank you again for allowing me to join the panel at the tail end, and I hope some of this will echo to what you have already heard and hopefully make part of the conversation we need to take forward. Thank you, Manish.
I realize we're already past 3 o'clock, and this has been such a rich conversation. If I could beg your indulgence just for 2 or 3 more minutes, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists if they want to just make one quick comment to sum up. I know there were a number of questions that were asked. If you're able to answer them succinctly, great. But otherwise, I hope we can carry on this conversation bilaterally after we close the panel. Cletus? Andrew?
Extremely briefly, in response to the Chinese colleague on WeChat, I think the really positive and impressive thing about Chinese cities is the way that they manage to anticipate and proactively plan in advance of growth. Increasing motorization rates are, of course, contributing to some of their air pollution problems in larger cities, but equally impressive is the extent and expansion of the metro systems in those cities as well. And I'm reminded of a graph in the Green Economy Report, Cities chapter that UNEP produced with some of our help. It shows HDI increasing proportionally with emissions, essentially. So as human well-being increases, so do emissions. But when you disaggregate cities from that mix, they're managing to offer higher levels of human well-being at lower levels of emissions. And so if we can manage to capture that, and the partnership we've got with UNEP is looking at quantifying those trade-offs involved so that cities can make educated choices about how to grow, then we're better off.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Haibing, any final comments?
I'll address to this also recharge problem, like what kind of lessons we should learn from the Chinese experience. I think based on the experience of the last week's APEC meeting, I think Chinese leaders need to give up this kind of a short-term public face show, like shut down all the surrounding factory just to want to create this temporary blue Chinese government really wants to adopt those long-term systematic lifetime assessment approach to provide really sustainable way to transit its economy. And as I said, clean energy is definitely the solution. Go for it, and definitely, most importantly, create all the possible environment to support it.
Great. Thank you. Karen?
Very briefly, one takeaway for solutions to green economies is really looking into sharing and the learning process and also how you design integrated approaches.
Minister?
Thank you. Again, Ajim, the director, UNEP is domiciled in Nairobi, and before we're making the director proud. I'm happy you came, but before you came, I said last month we dispatched on the grid some 42% power from geothermal and another 35% from hydro. With the commissioning of some of the world largest geothermal plants in 140 megawatts twin, 280 megawatts in the last 2 months, geothermal is going to be dispatching up to 50% of the power on the grid for the economy. And so when you said, Manish, that solar in competition moved from US to China I was wondering in terms of really utilization and how much emission is happening, we should be looking at the domicile UNEP country of Kenya. I think the word here is leapfrogging, to very quickly answer my friend managing the South Initiative, in that fossil energy development going into the future may not be an option, because if you look at the unit cost of power generation, which is in something called specific fuel consumption, when you develop power using diesel and you measure the number of kilograms that you use to develop 1 kilowatt, you'll be talking about 17 cents. When you do geothermal, it is 2 cents. You do hydro, it is 0. You do solar, it is 0. You do wind, it is 0. The energy capacity charge might be slightly higher, but certainly on the economy of scale, it does not make economic sense unless you are producing fossil fuel for free to, into the future, develop energy using diesel. And then so really for us in Africa, as a continent to leapfrog and take advantage of the development of technology in photovoltaic, like Stena just said, in the wind generation, cost of production, I don't see generation from fossil fuel being an option going into the future. So it will just take us on the global South-South initiative to do a lot of education for us to understand that power generation on fossil fuel in terms of economy and running your country on the least cost end of ensuring that we are competitive, we are a green economy, and we are managing the ecosystem, then fossil fuel is not an option going to the future. Thank you very much.
Great. No, thank you very much. To close, these issues are increasingly front and center in economic and political conversations, are on the front page of papers such as Keystone. There is, despite that, a real opportunity, but a real challenge, because still in the mainstream press, a question about whether or not promoting sustainability is indeed good for growth, good for tackling poverty, good for challenging inequality. Yet emerging evidence hugely demonstrates that these two things often do go hand in hand, that protecting the environment, reducing environmental risk goes hand in hand with growth, with tackling poverty. What you heard today, a number of real seeds of change, examples from China, from Brazil, from Kenya, from a variety of countries from around the world, are where we're beginning to see that. And the real challenge before us is how do we get that to scale? And the role that South-South cooperation can play in helping get that to scale. So with that, thank you all for your patience, and please join me in extending a warm round of applause for our panelists today, and to all of you. Thank you. If I could just ask the audience to stay for the signing of the UNEP agreement with the OAS, which will take place here, which is why we ask you to stay. Thank you.